Why is this topic relevant? What is unilateral appointment of arbitrators? Why are we discussing, debating this issue? Is it very academic? Does it really have a practical significance, etc.?
Very happy to have Mr. Vikas Mahindra with us. He is a partner at Keystone Partners, and he is also the co-founder of Center for Online Dispute Resolution. Today he is here to talk with us on the topic unilateral appointment of arbitrators. Vikas sir, are we ready? Would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you very much for that introduction, Aditi, and I'm glad people are joining in despite the lockdown. Great to see that the interest in learning has not subsided and has not been hampered by the lockdown. So what I'll probably do during the course of this presentation is start off with some fundamental concept level issues to try and understand why is this topic relevant? What is unilateral appointment of arbitrators? Why are we discussing, debating this issue? Is it very academic? Does it really have a practical significance, etc.? Logical point to start that conversation is try and understand who is an arbitrator. I'm guessing a number of people who have joined the call here have done a course on arbitration or at least have some idea of what arbitration is. So I won't go into very much detail, but essentially an arbitration is a court outside of court where parties appoint an arbitrator or at least select a process by which a third party neutral is selected to decide a case finally between the parties. Now there are two elements here that is important. One is that there is a third party who's selected, that third party is a neutral, and that neutral makes a final and binding decision that impacts the parties to the dispute. Now, as a result of this element of finality, the neutrality element of it becomes very critical because it's not like someone within an organization is taking a decision and that decision you can now go to the courts. In fact, it is a third party such a decision can be challenged. Now, because there is such a great element of finality attached to this decision, there is some safeguards that the Arbitration Conciliation Act builds to ensure that this decision has some amount of sanctity. Now, the Arbitration Conciliation Act does not do this by prescribing qualifications of arbitrators. It does not say that only someone with, I don't know, a legal degree or a qualification or a master's degree can be an arbitrator. It does not. So long as the arbitrator is appointed in accordance with the clause in the agreement, that is fine. The qualifications are actually not relevant. But what is relevant is that decision maker follows due process, and that upon following due process, a decision is reached by adopting an independent method of inquiry. So not being biased towards one party or the other, an arbitrator, he or she takes a decision by following certain basic principles of natural justice. Now, one of the principles of natural justice, which is at the very heart of the discussions we'll have today, is that the decision that justice should not only be done, but it should also appear to be done, which means that it's not enough that you get the correct result, but the method in which that result is arrived at should also be something that is beyond reproach. So if any person looks at the process of decision making, he or she is convinced that there is some amount of objectivity, neutrality inherent in the process. A key requirement of this principle is that the decision maker is independent, neutral, and takes an objective view of matters. Now that is where the twin tests of independence and impartiality start making inroads. Now this concept of independence, impartiality is nothing new. Even if you look at it from the court systems, the element of independence and neutrality is always there. Because let's say, for instance, you come up in court and there is a matter which was filed by one of the lawyers who subsequently goes on to become a judge. obviously that judge would recuse himself or herself from that matter, because it is not appropriate for that particular judge to take an objective view of the matter in circumstances where there is, some potential of alleging that this person, having drafted the complaint or the petition, is now no longer in a position to take an objective view. It may be that that particular judge is beyond reproach, and that the decision, even if ultimately given, was absolutely correct. But because there is some element of independence that needs to be maintained, even for the neutral observer, that decision making by that person whose involvement in the case taints the independence is not permitted. And that is in the court system. Very similar concepts apply to an arbitration as well. And in an arbitration, it becomes a little bit more pronounced, because unlike in courts, the parties have a role in making the appointment of that arbitrator. Whether it is a single arbitrator or a 3-member tribunal, parties have a say in making an appointment of an arbitrator. Now, that goes into the very foundations of arbitration, which is party autonomy. In fact, people say that one of the significant advantages of arbitration is the ability of parties to make that choice of arbitrator, because then they can tailor the choice based on the dispute. For instance, if it is, let's say, a nuclear power plant which has a problem on whether performance of that nuclear power plant has been all right, instead of appointing a legal-minded person, maybe you will appoint a scientist, and that might be appropriate in that circumstance. And that choice given to the parties is a fundamental distinguishing feature of arbitration. But that choice comes with its own burden, which means because the parties have participated in the process of choosing their decision maker, that decision maker should ensure that simply because the parties have played a part in his or her appointment, the decision maker does not start leaning in favor of one or the other party. Now, this problem is particularly pronounced in arbitral tribunals comprising more than one arbitrator. As some of you might be aware, an arbitration may be held by either a sole arbitrator or any higher number of arbitrators, provided it's not an even number. So usually it's either by 1 or 3 arbitrators. In very rare exceptional circumstances, you may have 5 or 7 or so on. But when there's a 3-member tribunal, the normal rule is that the claimant nominates one arbitrator, the respondent nominates another arbitrator, and the 2 nominated arbitrators in turn appoint a 3rd presiding arbitrator. Now, the question one might ask is, so far as these party nominated arbitrators are concerned, are they under any duty to the party nominating them? How does independence, impartiality apply to this party nominated arbitrator? And the answer overwhelmingly and unambiguously is that irrespective of whether an arbitrator has been appointed by a party to the dispute, an arbitrator owes a duty of independence and impartiality, which is to the same high standard that any other arbitrator would be subject to. So, for instance, if you have an arbitration with just one arbitrator, when neither party have played a role in his appointment, let's say, for example, the court has nominated that arbitrator is under the exact same duty of independence and impartiality as a party nominated arbitrator. So the arbitrator is expected to ignore the fact that he or she has been nominated by one of the parties once that nomination has been made and the appointment to an arbitral tribunal has been confirmed. So having set out this broad-based understanding of independence and impartiality, and maybe rooting it back to how it plays in with party autonomy, let's go to how the Indian Arbitration Conciliation Act deals with this issue. And here I'll maybe deal with it a little bit on how it was before the 2015 amendments and post 2015 amendments. Prior to the 2015 amendments, the duty of independence and impartiality was quite generic under the Indian Arbitration Conciliation Act. In that, while the arbitrators had the same duty of independence and impartiality, there was no prescriptive guidelines as to when there would be a presumed impartiality or presumed bias of the arbitrator. That position is now changed subsequent to the 2015 amendments. The 2015 amendments say that there are two sets of criterion that you need to look at. And they are called the 5th schedule and the 7th schedule. And here, maybe I'll share the screen for those of you who've probably not seen it in a little bit in some detail. So the Arbitration Conciliation Act, and maybe I'll start with the appointment process of the arbitrators, which is at section 11 states, a person of any nationality may be an arbitrator unless otherwise agreed by the parties. 2 says the parties are free to agree on a procedure. 3, it says failing any agreement, this is the prescription of how the parties, the arbitrator shall be appointed. And maybe for present purposes, if you go into the clause which is most relevant, grounds for challenge. When a person is approached in connection with his possible appointment as an arbitrator, he shall disclose in writing any circumstances, such as the existence, either direct or indirect, of any past or present relationship with or interest in any of the parties or in relation to the subject matter of the dispute, whether financial, business, professional, or other kind, which is likely to give rise to justifiable doubts as to his independence or impartiality. Now, this is the factor that is what we had discussed in some detail until now. The statute specifically says that if a party is not independent or impartiality, then that is a ground to challenge an arbitrator. And the 2015 amendment specifically says that the ground stated in the 5th schedule shall guide in determining whether circumstances exist which gives rise to justifiable doubts as to an independence or impartiality of an arbitrator. And maybe there I'll pause a minute. The 5th schedule, to which we'll turn to very quickly, says that it is a guidance. So firstly, the 5th schedule is not mandatory. It simply says that if there is one of the circumstances identified in the 5th schedule which the arbitrator meets, then there's a presumption, or at least there is some doubts that there is lack of independence or impartiality. It is entirely possible that even if one of the 5th schedule entries is met, an arbitrator is independent and impartial, but at least there is some amount of explanation that will need to be given as to how that is there despite a 5th schedule entry. On the other hand, what we have in the 7th schedule, notwithstanding any prior agreement to the contrary, any person whose relationship with the parties or counsel or the subject matter of the dispute falls under any of the categories specified in the 7th schedule shall be ineligible to be appointed as an arbitrator. So the 7th schedule talks about circumstances where a person cannot be appointed as an arbitrator because there is presumed independence and impartiality, not just a doubt, but a presumption that there is there's a lack of independence and impartiality, preventing that person from acting as an arbitrator in that particular circumstance. Now, again, this background, let's go to the 5th and 7th schedule to see the kind of entries that are there. The 5th schedule says the following grounds give rise to justifiable doubts as to the independence or impartiality of the arbitrator. So justifiable doubts being the key element. Here it says the arbitrator is an employee, consultant, advisor, or has any other past or present business relationship with a party. It represents or advises one of the parties, represents the lawyer or law firm, etc. So there's a whole host of things. Under the broader bucket, arbitrator's relationship with the parties or counsel. Then there is a relationship of arbitrator to the dispute. For instance, if the arbitrator has previously advised the parties or some external party with respect to the same fact situation. The arbitrator's direct or indirect interest in the dispute. Previous service to one of the parties or involvement in the case. Relationship between an arbitrator and another counsel, etc. Relationship between party and the parties involved, and other circumstances. Now, the 7th schedule says arbitrator's relationship with the parties or counsel. Now, the 7th schedule is actually a subset of the 5th schedule. So, if you look at the number of entries here, some of them are duplicative of what's in the 5th schedule. That is because these circumstances, even though they fall within the 5th schedule, are of a greater magnitude in terms of what they mean in terms of lack of independence and impartiality. And this would be things like an arbitrator is an employee, consultant, advisor, or has any other past or present relationship with a party. Now, with that background, maybe we go back again to the conceptual foundation we were talking about, that requirement of independence or impartiality. The 2015 amendment makes it quite descriptive, and there's a number of different elements that are identified which gives rise to a presumption of lack of independence and impartiality. The one thing we need to notice here, which will be crucial for us to understand the rest of the presentation, is that neither the Act nor the schedules prescribe any condition which applies to anyone other than the arbitrator himself or herself. If I spell that out a little bit more, all of the conditions that are specified in the Act apply only to the arbitrator. It does not apply to anyone else. And that becomes, that's at the root of the discussion we're going to have. And maybe if I go back again to showing you the relevant entries which talk about it, here you will see the arbitrator is, the arbitrator currently, etc. So all of them starting off applying to the arbitrator. And even if you go back to section 12, which is the grounds for challenge, it will say that when the grounds for challenge are where there are justifiable doubts as to his independence or impartiality, the his here is a reference to the arbitrator. Now, why is this again relevant for our discussion? This is relevant for our discussion today because the topic unilateral appointment of arbitrators is something, while it uses the word arbitrator in its topic, is actually more directly talking about the role of the appointing person rather than the arbitrator appointed. Say, for instance, if I was to make an appointment of an arbitrator, the topic covers whether I am under some restraint to make that appointment, rather than whether the arbitrator I have appointed is under some restraint. The fact that the arbitrator I have appointed is under restriction is absolutely unambiguous and clear. The statute makes it amply clear. But what is, in my view, clear, but what the courts have said is unclear, is the role of the person appointing the arbitrator. Now let's deep directly into that specific issue. And maybe we start off with a 3-member tribunal. Like I mentioned, in a 3-member tribunal, there are 2 parties to the dispute, the claimant and the respondent. The claimant appoints an arbitrator, the respondent appoints an arbitrator. Now, each of the claimant and the respondent select an arbitrator based on who they feel would be best suited to their case. And this is not inconsistent with independence or impartiality. And let me explain how. All of us know, having read some of the judgments of courts, that with an identically worded clause or statute, different interpretations are possible. Judges and arbitrators at the end of the day are human, and they have certain tendencies of deciding in certain manners in certain cases. For instance, there are black letter lawyers, meaning lawyers or arbitrators or judges who go very strictly by the language of the contract or the language of the statute. In your case, such an interpretation might assist you in your case. And therefore, you might want such an arbitrator to be a part of the arbitration tribunal. On the other hand, another person might say, I need someone with an equitable bent of mind, because while technical interpretations might mean that I'm in breach, if you look at the overall circumstances, you will see that I'm not. And it may be a possible permissible interpretation of the contract. So that person might want such an arbitrator. It is not frowned upon by courts. It is perfectly acceptable for you to try and find an arbitrator who may be of a favorable disposition to you, so long as that disposition does not come in the way of independence and impartiality. So if it's a general disposition, it cannot come in the way of independence of impartiality. And one of the examples that's often quoted here, particularly in investment treaty cases, is subject matter bias, where, for instance, there are certain arbitrators who are very well known to have an inkling towards developing countries and certain others who have an inkling towards developed countries. And the debate has gone on forever as to whether it's okay to appoint such arbitrators into an arbitral tribunal. And the consistent answer has been that there's really no problem unless the arbitrator has actually made a finding or an observation with respect to that particular dispute or case study or another dispute which is almost identical to that case. So anyway, we come to saying that there is a legitimate basis on the basis of which parties choose, and parties choose in a biased fashion. And that understanding is fundamentally important for us to start recognizing the following discussion, that parties do have a propensity to find an arbitrator who is favorable to them. But that is not a ground under the Arbitration Conciliation Act to challenge the arbitrator unless the arbitrator himself or herself has some basis which justifies that challenge. With that in mind, let's now look at a sole arbitrator. In a sole arbitrator context, normally in complex commercial contracts, if there is a sole arbitrator, the rule is that both parties together make a nomination, and that nomination is the sole arbitrator. Usually they resort to either the courts in the event it is an ad hoc arbitration, or to an arbitrator unable to find common ground. In a sole arbitrator context, the influence that one or the other party has on the appointment in such a situation where there is a mutual agreement of the parties tends to be quite low. But that is also a contractual bargain. Note that every clause in a contract is a contractual bargain. So if the parties have chosen mutually to appoint an arbitrator, they are in some amount of equality. If there is a shift in that bargain, let's say for instance, someone says, okay, fine, instead of both of us jointly agreeing to nominate an arbitrator, I will give you the right to nominate an arbitrator. That may be a contractual bargain that I have reached, and I might have benefited from it. I might have said, okay, I'm giving up this clause. Why don't you say, give me lesser liquidated damages? Or why don't you give me a longer repayment period? Whatever. That is a contractual bargain. The question now is, if it is a contractual bargain between the parties, which provides one party a right to appoint an arbitrator unilaterally, does that make that clause questionable? And that is the topic which we will deep dive in immediately. Courts have had an opportunity to consider this previously, and they have consistently held that simply because a contract provides a party the right to nominate an arbitrator is not necessarily inconsistent with the Arbitration Conciliation Act. Meaning, there is no requirement under the Arbitration Conciliation Act for there to be equality of treatment of the parties at the stage of appointment of an arbitrator. Equality is necessary during the arbitral process. It cannot be that during the arbitral process is not permitted. But such a requirement does not extend to the point where appointment of arbitrators is being made. And therefore, there is nothing wrong with a party having the sole right to appoint an arbitrator. The consequence of this line of decisions was that approximately 75 to 80% of the contracts in India have unilateral appointment clauses. Now, that might be a shocking number for people, and that will probably explain to you why I chose this topic, simply because it has that much of an impact. The cases we see that goes to court as arbitrations, either for purpose of Section 11 or Section 34, or the kind of arbitrations you hear about in maybe big arbitration institutions, are the tip of the iceberg. They do not reflect the vast majority of arbitrations which are ongoing on an everyday basis. And let me give you examples. We have an arbitration, for instance, with BHEL. And BHEL is just one example where the standard form contract of BHEL says that BHEL has the right to appoint an arbitrator. And that is not just limited to BHEL, it extends to a number of government sector undertakings. Because there, they want to have that degree of certainty, control. And in fact, there's a couple of elements why people choose that. Not because they want a biased arbitrator, but because if you don't have, okay, let me go one step back. Firstly, 3-member tribunals are expensive. So if you go with 3 arbitrators to resolve a dispute for smaller values, then you're spending a lot of time and money and effort getting those arbitrators. Sometimes people think that's not workable, so let's go with sole arbitrator. If 2 parties have to agree on a sole arbitrator, I'll give it to you on basis of practical experience. In the 99% of the cases, once a dispute has arisen, parties do not agree, which means that you need to go to the courts or an arbitration institution to appoint an arbitrator. Unfortunately, institutional arbitration was not very popular in India, so the only option was to go to the court. If you go to the court, all of us know that to get an arbitrator appointed, it takes anywhere between 6 months to 1 or 2 years, and that's wasted time. So for legitimate reasons, a number of organizations say, no, I will appoint an arbitrator. I will appoint an independent arbitrator, but I will appoint an arbitrator. Let's get on with it. Let's get moving. I don't want to waste time. Second, courts tend to have a very limited pool of arbitrators. Most high courts, if you will see making the appointment, have only a panel of retired high court, district court, Supreme Court judges with very minor sprinkling of subject matter specialists. A number of people might say that's not good for me. I need someone who is a subject matter specialist, particularly with government sector undertakings. Again, if you look at, for instance, the railways, if you look at BHEL being one more, energy generation companies, a lot of their disputes require very in-depth knowledge of that particular sector. So for instance, if you're talking about railways, you're talking about freight charges, you're talking about the mobility of trains across the country. If you're talking of the electricity sector, you need to understand the transmission distribution network very well. They feel that it's not, the high courts cannot be trusted with doing them. So there are very legitimate grounds on the basis of which parties want to retain the choice of appointing an arbitrator. Not least of all is cost. Sole arbitrators appointed by the high courts are incredibly expensive. Now, with the 4th schedule coming in, even though 4th schedule is merely a guidance, parties have started adopting it, in most cases. But before that, at least, prohibitive costs of arbitrators. So the organizations felt that they needed to have some control over costs. So for all of these reasons, they felt that it's necessary to have some control as to who the arbitrator will be. That was accepted by the courts, and the courts had given leeway to organizations to unilaterally appoint arbitrators. In that vein, there are thousands of arbitrations happening where this unilateral appointment is in vogue. And when I told you 75-80%, some people might have said, no, that's outrageous, that can't be true. Let me give you an example. The Delhi Arbitration Center, the High Court Annexed Arbitration Center, and the Bangalore Annexed High Court Arbitration Center, if you take them as 2 instances, in the entire lifetime, they have resolved approximately 1,000 disputes each. If you take arbitration appointment applications in courts, there are approximately about 400 to 1,000 arbitration appointment applications if you take Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, etc. So that means in the course of a year, based on these numbers, you would think that the total number of arbitrations in India is approximately, I don't know, give or take about 2,000 or 3,000 across India, across sectors. But the reality is that the number of arbitrations happening in India is an exponential number of that. Any bank, for instance, within one sector has approximately 600 disputes every month which go to arbitration. And that's one bank, one sector. So you're looking at God knows how many thousands and millions of arbitrations which are going on at the moment. So I was talking about these unilateral clauses were in vogue. Now, once this was going on, what happened that made this entire thing questionable? What made this entire thing questionable, in my view, with due respect to the judiciary, is a fundamental error committed by the Supreme Court. And that error was made in the case of TRF versus Energo. Now, what are the facts of TRF versus Energo? TRF versus Energo was a contract where the clause says that the managing director of one of the parties shall be an arbitrator, failing which the managing director shall appoint another arbitrator. Now, subsequent to the 5th schedule coming in, because the managing director is an employee of the company, there was a disqualification, absolute 7th schedule disqualification. The managing director could not be an arbitrator. The question then arose, could that managing director make an onward appointment of another person? Now, going back with everything we've discussed so far, the answer would be absolutely no problem at all, because the party appointing the arbitrator has no requirement of independence, impartiality. Neither the act nor the schedule requires any such independence requirement of that person. So what's the problem? Let him go and make that appointment. But that's where the Supreme Court disagreed. And let me share my screen as to the relevant portions of the Supreme Court judgment there. Move this down. At para 53 of the judgment is where it says there's no quarrel that by virtue of section 12(5) of the act, if any person who falls under any of the categories specified in the 7th schedule shall be eligible to be appointed as an arbitrator. No difficulty there. And I completely agree with the Supreme Court there. There is no doubt and cannot be, for the language employed in the 7th schedule, the managing director of the corporation has become ineligible by operation of law. It is a stand of the learned senior counsel for the appellant that once a managing director becomes ineligible, he also becomes ineligible to nominate. Now, you will see here that this argument of the appellant has no reference to the section in the Arbitration Conciliation Act. Refuting the said stand, it is canvassed by the learned senior counsel for the respondent that the ineligibility cannot extend to a nominee if he is not from the corporation, and more so when there is apposite and requisite disclosure. This, in my view, is the correct position. It cannot extend to a nominee so long as the nominated arbitrator is not from the corporation and the nominated arbitration makes the requisite disclosures. We think, and this is where the court says, we think it appropriate to make it clear that in case at hand, we are neither concerned with the disclosure, nor objectivity, nor impartiality, nor any such circumstance. And this is crucial for us to understand. The Supreme Court saying that they're not concerned with disclosure. They're not concerned with objectivity. They're not concerned with impartiality. The question then is, what then are they concerned with? Because the Arbitration Conciliation Act, so far as I'm aware, only talks about independence and impartiality. And if you're not concerned with either independence or impartiality, then what are you concerned with? And if there is a concern, what is the basis for that concern? They go on. We're singly concerned with the issue whether the managing director, after becoming eligible by operation of law, is he still eligible to nominate an arbitrator? Again, why is this question arising? They don't say. At the cost of repetition, we may state that where there are two parties, one may nominate an arbitrator and the other party may appoint another. That is altogether a different situation. Again, big mistake. Because what the Supreme Court is saying that, when we're talking about 3-member tribunal where each party makes a nomination, that's fine because, one party making an appointment is balanced out by another party making an appointment. But like we were discussing, the standard of independence and impartiality that applies to a 3-member tribunal is no different from what it applies to a sole arbitrator. So how is the situation altogether different? I simply fail to understand. Let's read on. If there is a clause requiring the parties to nominate the respective arbitrator, the authority to nominate cannot be questioned. What really in that circumstance can be called into question is the procedural compliance and the eligibility of their arbitrator depending upon the norms provided under the Act and the schedules appended thereto. Correct. Their authority to nominate cannot be questioned because there's nothing in the Arbitration Act which allows the Supreme Court to do it. But here is a case where the managing director is the named sole arbitrator and he has also been conferred with the power to nominate one who can be the arbitrator in his place. Now, here is where they start making a conceptual muddle. They say, thus there is subtle distinction. In this regard, our attention has been drawn to a two-judge bench so and so. In this case, the question arose, can the Board of Revenue revise the order so and so and so? They said, a fourth authorities have to be commended to us to establish the proposition that if the nomination of an arbitrator by an eligible arbitrator is allowed, it would tantamount to carrying on the proceedings of an arbitration by himself. Now, this is in some senses an argument that the Supreme Court accepted. They said, in this case, the managing director cannot act as an arbitrator, but his nominee can act as an arbitrator. So it's tantamount to the nominee doing, the managing director doing something through his nominee. That is where the the Supreme Court assumes that the person nominated by the managing director is under the control, supervision of the managing director, which is wrong, because an arbitrator is not under anyone's control. Even in a party nominated arbitrator, arbitrator is independent, not under anyone's control. And therefore, it is not that the arbitrator is doing something on behalf of a party. The arbitrator is discharging an independent function, irrespective of who has nominated that arbitrator. But somehow, they felt that in this case, it would tantamount to doing something through someone else when you're personally restricted from doing it. In such context, the fulcrum of the controversy would be, can an ineligible arbitrator like the managing director nominate an arbitrator who may otherwise be eligible? Here, please note here, who may otherwise be eligible and a respectable person. As stated earlier, we are neither concerned with the objectivity nor individual respectability. We are only concerned with the authority. By our analysis, we are obligated to arrive at the conclusion that once the arbitrator has become ineligible by operation of law, he cannot nominate another as an arbitrator. Now, there become ineligible by operation of law to arbitrate the dispute. But where is this disqualification from nomination arriving? The Supreme Court doesn't explain. The arbitrator becomes ineligible as per the prescription contained in 12.5. Correct? The arbitrator becomes ineligible. It is inconceivable in law that a person who is statutorily ineligible can nominate a person. And this I don't understand at all. Again, going back to the three-member tribunal situation, obviously, if I'm a party to the dispute, I cannot be an arbitrator. That doesn't mean that I cannot nominate a person. So why it is inconceivable in law that a person who is statutorily ineligible can nominate a person, I simply do not understand. They go on to say, needless to say, once the infrastructure collapses, superstructure is bound to collapse, so on and so forth. They start giving examples of a building, doesn't really make that much of an improvement to that case. Now, in the backdrop of TRF versus Energo, there was some confusion as to what is the status of unilateral appointment clauses. And the Delhi High Court jumped into our rescue with some amount of face saving there. In a number of judgments, they said TRF versus Energo is very limited to the facts. It's only when the contract says that X to be an arbitrator, failing which he shall nominate, it does not apply to unilateral appointment clauses. For instance, if a clause says BHEL shall appoint an arbitrator, that's fine. But if a clause says the managing director of BHEL shall be an arbitrator, and if he does not agree, then he shall nominate someone, that second category is the only limited circumstance to which TRF versus Energo applies. That way, they were trying to limit the scope of it. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court in Perkins Eastman's versus HSCC did not follow the Delhi High Court's lead to do something sensible. They followed TRF versus Energo. In para 53 of the judgment, sorry, yeah. Yeah. Here, the court referred to TRF Limited. This court said, in TRF Limited, the managing director of the respondent had nominated a former judge of this court as sole arbitrator in terms of the forcible clause, after which the appellant had preferred an application under section so-and-so. The appellee was rejected by the High Court and the appeal therefrom so-and-so. As regards the issue about fresh appointment, the court remanded the matter so-and-so. It is clear from the clause in the instant case that no special qualifications are resident, so on and so forth. In the forced circumstance, in our view, case is made out to entertain the instant application preferred by application so-and-so. Let me just quickly do, yeah. Sorry, this is the relevant problem. We thus have two categories of cases. The first, similar to the one dealt with in TRF, where the managing director himself is named as an arbitrator with an additional power to appoint any other person as an arbitrator. In the second category, the managing director is not to act as an arbitrator himself, but is empowered to or authorized to appoint any other person of his choice or discretion as an arbitrator. If in the first category of cases, the managing director was found incompetent, it was because of the interest that he would be said to have in the outcome of the result of the dispute. The element of invalidity would thus be directly relatable to and arise from the interest that he would have in such outcome or decision. If that be the test, similar invalidity would always arise and spring even in the second category of cases. If the interest that he has in the outcome of the dispute is taken to be basis for the possibility of bias, it will always be present irrespective of whether the matter stands under first or second category. So here we see that the Supreme Court very categorically extends the test of bias to the person making the nomination. We're conscious that if such deduction is drawn from the decision in TRF, all cases having similar clauses to that which we are presently concerned with, a party to the agreement would be disentitled to make any appointment of an arbitrator on its own, and it would always be available to argue that a party or an officiant or an authority having interest in the dispute would be disentitled. But in our view, that has to be the logical deduction from TRF. Whether the managing director, after becoming ineligible by operation of law, is he still eligible to nominate an arbitrator? The ineligibility referred to therein was the result of operation of law, in that a person having an interest in the dispute or in the outcome of the decision must not only be ineligible to act as an arbitrator, but also not be eligible to appoint anyone else as an arbitrator, and that such person cannot and should not have any role in charting out a course to the dispute resolution by having the power to appoint an arbitrator. So with this, the Supreme Court has very categorically said that if the unilateral arbitration clause says that X organization shall nominate an arbitrator, then no person within that organization shall have any ability to appoint that arbitrator, because every person within that organization has an interest in the outcome of the dispute. Now, with that, I recognize it's 8:15 and I really want to leave some time for questions. So I'll take 2 more minutes to say something very briefly. Now, an exception to this can be made where, for instance, the organization, let's say I said BHEL does not make the appointment of the arbitrator itself, but it, let's say, has no interest in the outcome of the dispute. So to that extent, you can say that you can try and circumvent this clause by not directly making an appointment, but by getting an independent institution to make this nomination for you. Of course, with language like this, where it says should not have any role in charting out a course, it is arguable that even selecting MCIA as making a nomination is playing a role in the charting out of any course. But I think that's the only logical explanation that can be given, while also retaining earlier line of cases which have upheld the validity of unilateral appointment clauses. The second point I want to make is that where there is a unilateral appointment clause, if the counterparty does not take an objection to this unilateral appointment immediately upon coming to know of this ground for challenge, then it is arguable that that other party has waived any grounds to challenge this nomination. Because let us recognize that there is not a 7th schedule challenge. Therefore, it is not an inherent disqualification. It is by way of case law, and it is arguable that that right to challenge can be waived if the party does not take an objection on this basis at first instance. With that, maybe I will open the floor out for questions. I know there's been a few of them that have been coming through on chat. So please put down your questions on chat, and I think the moderator will streamline those for me to answer.
Yeah, hi. So I see a good question by Soham Banerjee here. He's saying, so I'm sorry, I just lost that question. Yeah.
Won't the nominee attract the reasonable presumption of bias as per the 5th schedule?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Soham has asked a few of them. So please tell me. You can ask me one.
Can I unmute him?
Sure. I mean, if that possibility is there, then please go ahead.
Yeah, just a second. I'll try to unmute. Yes.
Or maybe I can find Soham, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Soham, you're unmuted. So please go ahead and ask the question.
Yeah. So I'll ask you the question. I'll ask you the question which I feel wasn't addressed due to paucity of time in this. When you talk about the TRF and the Perkins ratio, effectively saying that unilateral appointment of arbitrators has been done away with, don't you think that the ratio in railway electrification or voice still pin, as far as panel appointment of arbitrators goes, creates an exception to the unilateral appointment?
Okay, let me clarify. I don't think even with Eastman and TRF, unilateral appointment clauses are invalidated. Like I've told you, there is a workaround. I think if that institution, let's say for example BHEL, nominates a third party institution to make that appointment of an arbitrator, and BHEL itself does not play a role, I think that nomination of that arbitrator is still valid. Second, even if they don't use a third party, if they themselves go ahead and make that appointment of that arbitrator, I don't think it's, unless the other party challenges, necessarily defeats the entire arbitration. If the arbitration has gone ahead, then I think there's a good ground to argue that the other party is waived, because it's not an inherent limitation under the Act. The point that you still make is still valid though. The Voestalpine line of cases, where they say that panel appointments are valid, will still continue to hold the fort because they have not been set aside. In fact, all of these are coordinate benches. So there's not been an overruling of Voestalpine. In fact, there's not been an overruling of earlier line of cases which have held that unilateral appointment clauses are also valid. So to that extent, I don't think we are in a territory where there has been a very specific overruling. There will definitely be an exception for panel appointment of arbitrators. I think there is still a workaround for unilateral appointment clauses, of course, subject to the condition that the arbitrator actually satisfies the test of independence and impartiality.
Thank you.
Then we have another from Ankita as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ankita Singh, right? I can
Yeah.
unmute her. She seemed Ankit Singh. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Ankit, I think you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, sir. Glad to have you here. But the question, my question is, if parties are not treated equally at the time of appointment of tribunal, can they not challenge the entire award under Section 34?
Okay, let me answer that by reference to on what basis in the enactment will we challenge that, right? Let's take the Arbitration Conciliation Act, and maybe I can share my screen for that. The Arbitration Conciliation Act, if we look at grounds of equality, maybe start with that. Equal treatment of parties, Section 18. The party shall be treated with equality, and each party shall be given a full opportunity to present his case. Please see here that this falls under the not and conduct of arbitral proceedings is the manner in which the proceedings are conducted. And even if you read this clause, it is consistent with that. Parties shall be treated with equality, and each party shall be given a full opportunity of presenting his case. So the presumption and the way the courts have interpreted Section 18 is that this equality requirement is a dispute not contemplated, again not there. The composition of the arbitral tribunal is the composition in accordance with the agreement of the parties, and the unilateral appointment clause is in accordance with the agreement of the parties, unless such agreement was in conflict with the provision of this part from which the parties cannot derogate. Of course, if the Arbitration Act said that both parties shall have an equal right to appoint an arbitrator, then we can talk about this being attracted. But as of now, there is no clause in the Arbitration Act that this violates, or failing such agreement was not in accordance with this part. So I don't think there is anything in the Arbitration Conciliation Act itself which would lend credence to that argument.
All right. Thank you, sir.
So then we have Dipanvita's question. Actually, that's a similar question that I have even. So usually in a standard form contracts, a person does not have a role in actually bargaining the contract. These are all standard contracts. They just come and sign it. So the ones we talked about, the government contracts. In that case, how does the contract bargaining power still come in the role of appointing a sole arbitrator?
Right.
Like how does that justify it?
Excellent question, and let me answer that in two parts. Inequality of bargaining power is not restricted to standard form contracts. Inequality of bargaining power applies even no private party has any role to negotiate anything in a government contract. It is what they impose on you. Now the question is, simply because there is an inequality, does that mean that the parties have not been able to negotiate that. I mean, they have not been able to negotiate, or if they have not been able to negotiate, should they be given some sort of protection by law? That question, I don't agree, has to necessarily be answered the same way across all elements of inequality. For instance, if there is an inequality in consumer contracts between a consumer and, let's say, a bank, in that case, the statute has recognized that that inequality requires protection. And therefore, there is the Consumer Protection Act. And that inequality is remedied by giving a special forum. And in fact, cases have held that an arbitration clause cannot override a consumer forum. So if a consumer wants to go to the consumer forum, then you cannot drag that person to arbitration. Therefore, the law has recognized that that inequality needs to be addressed. But the law has also recognized as a legislative policy that the inequality between bigger players, let's say a major L&T type of player and the government of India, need not be addressed by a statutory protection, because the market will let itself play. For instance, if the government is being too unreasonable or onerous, no one will bid for that contract. And then hopefully the government will change their terms. So the legislative policy has been to allow parties to live with that inequality and not make any special concessions to address it. So that's, again, the fundamental point I'm saying is, not all inequality is necessarily a bad thing, or not all inequality requires statutory protection.
Sir, can we discuss some international perspective in
Okay, on the international perspective, the reason I was hesitant to go in with it is, one, because of paucity of time, and second, because there's no internationally prevalent norm. In fact, unilateral option clauses or unilateral arbitrator appointment clauses have been treated very differently in a whole host of countries. For instance, there are countries which have said that the requirement of equality under the UNCITRAL model law does not only extend to the conduct of arbitration proceedings, but should also extend to the appointment of arbitrators. But that view has not been very widely accepted. Certainly not in India, and certainly not in most common law countries that are popular arbitration seats. Certain other countries have gone ahead to say that arbitration of the Supreme Court can overrule this as being inconsistent with the statute and wrong. Yeah, if the legislature does it, great, but I don't know. I don't have great hopes on it. But hoping that at least this way, while unilateral option clauses are becoming difficult to enforce, there is some push towards institutional arbitration, and it may be the maybe unwanted impact of this entire progress, where we move towards some more independent, neutral dispute resolution. And actually, maybe at that point, let me give you my personal take on unilateral option clauses. Now, unilateral option clauses, I've told you all the reasons why people might want it. But in reality, what has happened is, once there's a unilateral appointment clause, particularly from a smaller panel of arbitrators, where there is constant reappointment, there is always some degree of, I need to be good to this particular client because I keep getting repeat appointments from them. The way to solve it is not really to attack the unilateral appointment bit, but to attack the panel appointment bit, and to ensure that even if there is a panel appointment, you can't keep getting repeat appointments. And there is therefore voestalpine and not so much the unilateral appointment clauses being valid.
We have Anurag Rajagopalan. I'll unmute.
I can't seem to see an Anurag on the participant list. Anurag, yeah, sure.
Yeah, he.
Hi, Anurag. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah,
if you typed it up, then I can see it. Okay, from a commercial perspective, would you then agree that the right to unilateral appointment of arbitrator is a risk price in the parties, or would you say that deemed unilateral appointment is not a risk at all given the protection under Schedule 5? I think in certain clauses, it is certainly a risk which is priced within the contract. I know for sure, I work with a number of very big companies who ensure that if there is such a clause in the contract, they automatically increase the price of the contract. And therefore, it is certainly risk priced in a number of contracts. Would you say that deeming unilateral appointment is not a risk at all given the protection under Schedule 5? I think, again, unilateral appointment clauses versus a Schedule 5 conflict, I don't really see that as being a conflict, because even with unilateral appointment clauses, there is a safeguard that can protect the parties. But like I said, those safeguards can only get you a certain way. There is a certain element of disposition which cannot be classified as lack of independence and impartiality. So therefore, there is always that delta which needs to be priced into the contract. So there is always a pricing towards that risk where one party has the right to nominate an arbitrator, the other party doesn't.
Soham asks, in the light of current judicial trends, how would you suggest appointment clauses be drafted?
I would say move away from unilateral appointment clauses and ensure, because see, to be perfectly honest, even in unilateral, maybe in a really, really big case they do. But in the vast majority of cases, like I was telling you in banks, they don't really think about who it is. In fact, no one in the bank does it. And to be perfectly honest, I'll give you a practical reality. The arbitrator appointments are usually done by the lawyer of the client, and the client has very little insight into who the actual arbitrator is in these circumstances. So therefore, I think the unilateral appointment process, it's time people start moving away from it. But the benefits I mentioned can still be preserved. You can still insist on some amount of specialization or expertise. You can still ensure that this appointment happens very quickly. You can still ensure that the fees payable to the arbitrator is under control, which are the three main factors why unilateral option clauses unilateral appointment clauses had become prevalent. So you can choose an institution which fits the bill. In fact, in that context, let me mention CODR, which is Center for Online Dispute Resolution, where that's exactly what we intend to do. We're working with people who have existing clauses, including unilateral appointment clauses, and say, hey, come to us, we will make that nomination. And you will see that the price points are things that will work to you. You will ensure that you'll get arbitrator appointments within 24 hours to 48 hours, so you're not wasting time. We have sector specialists, so you are able to get all of these things addressed. And therefore, I think the best outcome is to start moving towards institutional arbitration, at least for appointment. But I think a more generic shift to institutional arbitration for the entire arbitration proceedings is probably a good thing. And in fact, on that, since I have a lot of students here on this call, let me also say there is a golden opportunity for students such as yourselves to start choosing arbitration as an arbitrator as a career choice. Like there are career judges, I think there is a definite path for career arbitrators, because with unilateral appointment clauses going, and with another judgment which is also quite interesting, the Bombay High Court in Godiwala, where they said that the same arbitrator cannot be appointed more than maybe 8 or 10 times. They had arbitrators which was appointed 2,000 times.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for joining us today.